You really think she can beat me? Richard Bennett, the billionaire CEO, smirked as he sat at the luxurious, polished mahogany table, surrounded by his elite guests. The room fell silent, the air thick with the tension of this high-stakes dinner party. He glanced at the 10-year-old girl standing beside her mother, Maria, the black waitress who had been serving drinks all evening. Amara, the little girl, had been quiet the whole time, her dark eyes observing everything around her. "I'll play," Amara said with a calmness that surprised everyone. Richard laughed, his arrogance filling the room. "Fine. If you win, I'll give you $100 million. But we both know that's not happening." The guests chuckled, amused by his challenge. Amara sat down in front of the chessboard that had been set up in front of her. Her mother, Maria, stood nearby, holding her tray of drinks, silently watching the unfolding scene. Amara's fingers brushed over the pieces, steady and composed. The crowd looked on with amusement as Richard confidently made his first move. He was a man used to control, used to winning in every aspect of his life. No one in the room expected the quiet little girl to pose any challenge at all. But as Amara's small fingers moved the chess pieces, there was a precision, a confidence that hinted at something much more. Richard leaned back in his chair, watching her moves with a cocky smile. "Checkmate in 4 moves," he said, convinced that he would easily win. But Amara didn't flinch. Her eyes remained focused, her posture steady. She countered with a move so unexpected, it took Richard a second to even realize what had happened. The room grew quiet as he stared at the board. "Wait, what?" he muttered under his breath. The crowd leaned in, their eyes shifting between the board and Amara's calm expression. The game was shifting. Richard had underestimated her. Big mistake. Amara made another move. Richard's cocky smirk began to fade as he realized she was playing circles around him. His fingers tapped nervously against the table as his mind raced to catch up. He was losing. The billionaire CEO, the man who had built an empire, the one who had made millions, was about to be outplayed by a child. The silence in the room was deafening. Amara, who had been ignored and underestimated for the entire evening, now held the power. Richard's face turned pale as Amara made the final move. He looked at the board, then at her, his confidence shattered. "How did you?" he stammered. Amara didn't respond. She simply looked at him, her eyes calm, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. The room, once filled with the noise of high society, now stood in stunned silence. Amara had won. Richard had lost. And in that moment, the power dynamics had shifted. The crowd was in disbelief. The quiet little girl, who had been dismissed and belittled, had just proven that sometimes the most powerful force in the room is the one that no one expects. The room was still, the hum of chatter and clinking glasses fading into the background as Richard Bennett stared at the chessboard in disbelief. His fingers trembled slightly, hovering over the pieces, trying to make sense of the position he had found himself in. Amara Turner, the quiet, unassuming girl he had so carelessly mocked, had just outplayed him. He had never expected this. The weight of his arrogance pressed down on him like a ton of bricks. For a moment, Richard was speechless, staring at the little girl who now held the power in the room. The guests around him were equally silent, watching the scene unfold with bated breath. Maria, Amara's mother, stood in the corner of the room, her expression unreadable, but a flicker of pride crossed her eyes as she glanced at her daughter. Richard, still in a daze, finally managed to break the silence. "How did you?" He trailed off, unable to finish his question. Amara's gaze remained steady, her posture unshaken, as if the entire room no longer mattered. She had already won. Without a word, she reached forward and made her final move, the one that sealed the game. A subtle shift in the pieces, and Richard's fate was sealed. "Checkmate," Amara said softly, her voice calm, but with an air of finality. The room seemed to hold its breath as Richard looked at the board, then at her. His face, once filled with confident arrogance, now showed signs of shock, disbelief, and a hint of humiliation. He had lost. To a child. To the girl he had belittled just moments ago. He felt his heart race, the sting of his own hubris cutting deeper than any loss of a game. The silence in the room was deafening. The guests, who had once laughed at the thought of a young girl outplaying a billionaire, now stood in stunned silence, unable to process what had just happened. Richard finally straightened up, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I didn't expect this, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Amara didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her calm demeanor spoke louder than any words ever could. As the room slowly started to stir, the whispers began. People exchanged glances, unsure of how to react to the unthinkable. Richard had been humbled, and in front of his peers, no less. He had never imagined this moment. Never imagined that his arrogance would be his downfall at the hands of someone so seemingly insignificant. And yet, here it was. Amara had taken him down with nothing more than her intelligence, her quiet strength, and the unwavering confidence that had been dismissed as mere naivety. Maria, still standing at the back of the room, finally spoke, her voice steady but laced with pride. She's more than you think. The words hung in the air, a challenge to everyone who had ever underestimated her daughter. Richard, still trying to recover, nodded slowly, his mind racing. I see that now, he said, his tone softer, more humbled. The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. Richard had been knocked off his pedestal, and Amara stood as the unexpected victor. The game of chess, once a symbol of Richard's control, had become a metaphor for the power of underestimation. Amara had proven that sometimes the quietest voices carry the greatest weight. As the shock in the room slowly faded, Richard Bennett tried to regain his composure. He stood there, looking at Amara, his mind still processing what had just happened. His entire life had been built on confidence and control, but in a matter of minutes, all of that had crumbled. He had underestimated her. He had dismissed her as just a child, but now he stood before her, defeated. The murmurs around the room grew louder, but Richard couldn't focus on them. He was still fixated on the chessboard, the pieces in their final positions. His hand hovered above the board, unsure of what to do next. I don't understand, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Maria, standing in the corner, could see the internal struggle Richard was going through. She had known Amara's brilliance for years, but seeing it unfold in front of a room full of strangers, especially a man like Richard, was something else entirely. Amara didn't say anything, her eyes still steady, her focus unbroken. She was calm, almost serene, as if the whole situation were just another day for her. It's just a game, she said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight that Richard hadn't anticipated. He looked at her, his arrogance slipping away. The confidence that once defined him now seemed fragile, exposed. No, Richard replied, his voice quieter now. It's not just a game. He stopped, unable to finish his sentence. I didn't think you'd be capable of this. Maria stepped forward, a proud but gentle smile playing on her lips. You're not the first to underestimate her, she said, her voice calm but filled with the kind of pride only a mother could have. And you won't be the last. The room was silent again, the guests unsure of how to react to the unfolding drama. Richard's mind was still racing. He had built an empire by recognizing patterns, understanding people, and outsmarting everyone who stood in his way. But this was different. This was a child who had done what even his most trusted advisors couldn't. He had lost to a girl whose name he hadn't even bothered to learn until now. His eyes flicked to the guests around him, their expressions a mix of disbelief and admiration. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt small. He was used to being the one who made others feel inferior, but now he stood in front of Amara, his pride shattered. I didn't think it was possible, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Amara looked at him, her gaze unwavering. I didn't think it was possible either, she said quietly. But sometimes, people forget that strength doesn't always look the way they expect it to. The words hung in the air, a silent challenge to everyone in the room who had ever underestimated someone based on their appearance, their background, or their age. Richard nodded slowly, the weight of Amara's words sinking in. He had always prided himself on his ability to read people. But this was a lesson he wasn't expecting to learn. I was wrong, Richard said finally, his voice low but sincere. You're incredible. For a moment, the room remained silent. Then, slowly, the guests began to clap, a slow, hesitant applause that grew louder as they realized the magnitude of what had just happened. Richard Bennett, the billionaire CEO, had been outsmarted by a child. And in that moment, the power in the room shifted. Amara had proven that sometimes intelligence, strength, and resilience come in the most unexpected forms. Richard may have lost the game, but Amara had won something far greater: respect. The applause slowly died down, but the room remained filled with an electric tension. Richard Bennett stood there, still processing the weight of the loss. He had always been in control, always had the final word, and now, here he was, standing in front of a young girl, a mere child, who had completely undone him in a matter of moments. The arrogance that had defined him, the arrogance that had built his empire, had been shattered by a game of chess. And it wasn't just the game. It was the realization that he had dismissed someone so powerful, so capable, because he couldn't see past his own assumptions. The guests, now fully aware of what had just transpired, began to whisper among themselves. It wasn't the usual chatter of business deals or luxury. No, this was something different, something more profound. Richard glanced around, meeting the eyes of his peers. They looked at him, some with pity, others with admiration for the young girl who had somehow turned the tables. He could feel their judgment, but it didn't sting as much as the realization that he had learned nothing about true power. True power wasn't about money. It wasn't about control. It wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. True power was about understanding the worth of others, seeing them for what they truly were, not what you expected them to be. Amara's quiet strength had proven that. Maria stepped forward, her hand gently resting on her daughter's shoulder, her pride evident in the way she held herself. "She doesn't need your validation," Maria said, her voice steady and unwavering. "But she's earned your respect." Richard's heart skipped a beat as those words sank in. He had never considered respect to be something that had to be earned. In his world, respect was demanded. But now, standing in front of this woman and her daughter, he saw a different perspective. It wasn't about money or status. It was about the quiet dignity that came from within, the kind of dignity that couldn't be bought. Amara didn't need to speak loudly to command attention. She didn't need to make grand gestures to prove her worth. She simply needed to be herself, and that was more than enough. Richard felt a wave of humility wash over him. For the first time in a long while, he questioned everything he had built his life upon. He had always believed in the hustle, in outsmarting everyone else, in playing the game. But what good was all that if you couldn't see the value in the people around you? What good was all that if you couldn't recognize greatness when it stood right in front of you? Amara's brilliance wasn't just in her intellect. It was in the way she carried herself, the way she refused to be underestimated. In that moment, Richard Bennett realized something profound. He wasn't the smartest person in the room. He wasn't the most important person in the room. And that was okay, because sometimes the people you least expect to change everything are the ones who do. And Amara, with her quiet strength and her unwavering confidence, had just done exactly that. As Richard turned to face her one last time, he could no longer see the same little girl who had been serving drinks only hours before. He saw a future leader, a force to be reckoned with, someone who would one day change the world. And for the first time in his life, Richard Bennett didn't mind being reminded that there were people out there who could teach him more than he could ever teach them. Richard Bennett stood in stunned silence, his mind still grappling with what had just occurred. The clinking of glasses and the murmur of guests around him seemed to fade into the background. He was no longer the center of attention. It was Amara, the young girl who had outsmarted him in a game he had played countless times, who had become the focus of the evening. Her calmness, her brilliance, it all stood in sharp contrast to the frantic, egotistical world he had built for himself. The arrogance that had defined him, that had propelled him to the heights of success, now felt irrelevant. It wasn't power that held sway in this room. It wasn't wealth or influence. It was the quiet strength of someone who had been overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed. Richard realized then that the lesson wasn't just about losing a game of chess. It was about losing the perspective that had kept him blind to the real value of those around him. Maria Turner, Amara's mother, had always known what her daughter was capable of. She had seen Amara's potential long before the world would ever recognize it. And as she stood there now, watching the transformation in Richard's eyes, Maria felt a deep sense of pride. She knew that her daughter had not only won a game, but had also opened Richard's eyes to something far more important: the importance of seeing people for who they truly were. It wasn't about titles, about wealth, about power. It was about the worth that lay within, the intelligence, the resilience, the dignity. Richard Bennett had been so caught up in his own image, in the game he had mastered, that he had failed to see the people who could challenge him in ways he never anticipated. And now, as he stood before Amara, he was faced with the reality that this young girl, who had once been just a server in his eyes, had shown him what true greatness looked like. He felt a strange mix of admiration and regret. He had been wrong. He had been so sure of his own superiority that he had dismissed those who didn't fit the mold he had created. But now he understood. Amara had not only outplayed him on the chessboard, but had also proven that intellect and greatness could come from the most unexpected places. The crowd around them began to stir again, but this time, it wasn't with whispers of disbelief or shock. It was with an unspoken respect. Richard could feel the shift. It wasn't just in him, it was in the room. The realization that Amara, despite everything she had been through, despite the odds stacked against her, had come out on top. And for the first time in a long time, Richard felt the weight of humility. He took a deep breath, stepped forward, and extended his hand toward Amara. "I was wrong," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "You're incredible. I've never met anyone like you." Amara looked up at him, her expression calm and steady, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, a quiet acknowledgement that this moment had meant more than just winning a game. It had meant proving that worth isn't measured by the titles or the wealth you possess. It's something deeper, something far more enduring. "Thank you," Amara said simply, her voice soft but carrying the weight of everything she had just proven. The room stood in silence for a moment longer, as if the very air had shifted. Richard Bennett, the billionaire CEO, had learned a valuable lesson. And it wasn't just about chess. It was about recognizing the greatness in others, no matter where they came from or what they looked like. Amara Turner had shown him that, and for that, Richard would forever be grateful. The evening continued, but the energy in the room had shifted. Richard Bennett, still processing the events that had unfolded, walked slowly toward the bar. His mind raced as he replayed the moments when he had stood so confidently, dismissing Amara and her mother, only to be brought low by the young girl's unexpected brilliance. As he reached for a drink, his hand paused. He could see it now. His life, his work, everything he had built. He had always believed it was about control. The more people he outsmarted, the more successful he became. But he had never realized how much he had overlooked. How many moments like this had passed him by without him even noticing? The power he had relied on, his wealth, his position, his ability to manipulate situations, had crumbled in the face of a young girl's intellect and grace. Richard felt a surge of humility. He looked across the room at Amara, still standing with her mother. There was no arrogance in her gaze, no smirk to rub in his face, just quiet confidence. Maria, Amara's mother, caught his gaze and offered him a soft, knowing smile. It was a smile that spoke of years of quiet struggle, of watching her daughter grow into someone capable of moments like this. Richard had never seen Maria like this before. He had never seen her as more than just a waitress, a figure in the background, serving the wealthy with a smile. But now he saw her differently. He saw the strength in her eyes, the quiet resolve that had carried her through life. He saw how much she had taught her daughter, not just about the world, but about standing tall in it. Maria walked over to Richard, her steps measured, confident. She stopped beside him, and for a moment, neither spoke. The weight of everything that had happened seemed to hang in the air between them. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "She's incredible," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Maria nodded. "She always has been." Richard turned to face her. "I was wrong about her. About both of you. I didn't see it before." Maria smiled again, but this time it was more than just a gesture of kindness. It was a smile of quiet victory. "It's not about what you see," she said softly. "It's about what you're willing to recognize when it's right in front of you." Richard thought about that for a moment. What had he missed? What else had he been blind to because he was too caught up in his own world? He had always prided himself on being able to read people, on knowing exactly how to maneuver in every situation. But now he understood. It wasn't enough to just know the game. You had to know the people in it. You had to understand them, truly understand them. And in that moment, Richard Bennett realized that he had learned more in the last few hours than he had in years of business meetings and high-stakes deals. He had learned what true power looked like. It wasn't in the boardrooms or the contracts. It was in the quiet moments, the moments of integrity, the moments when people chose to do what was right even when no one was watching. Amara had shown him that. Richard looked at Maria, then at Amara, and for the first time, he saw them not as employees, not as people in his life to serve him, but as equals. "Thank you," Richard said, his voice filled with sincerity, "for opening my eyes." Maria placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of quiet grace. "The world doesn't owe you understanding," she said gently, "but it always has a way of showing you what you need to see when you're ready." Richard nodded, a weight lifting off his shoulders. He had never felt this. Humbled, never felt like he had something to prove more than he did now. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't about control. It was about being open, about recognizing that the people you least expect might hold the greatest lessons. And in that moment, Richard Bennett knew he would never look at the world the same way again. As the evening drew to a close, Richard Bennett found himself standing at the edge of the room, lost in thought. The once lively conversations around him felt distant, muffled by the weight of his own introspection. He could feel the presence of Maria and Amara nearby, their quiet strength a stark contrast to the chaotic world he had always known. He had come to this event thinking he would be the one in control, the one calling the shots. But now, as he looked around the room, he realized that control wasn't always what mattered. In fact, he had learned something far more important. It wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room or the one with the most influence. It was about the quiet moments, the ones where true character was revealed. Richard turned and walked over to where Maria and Amara stood, their heads held high. Maria looked at him, her gaze calm but knowing, as though she had already seen the man he was becoming. He stopped in front of them, unsure of what to say at first. For the first time in years, Richard Bennett was at a loss for words. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of the realization that had settled in. "You've done something I didn't think was possible." Maria smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. "You're not the only one who learns lessons," she said, her voice gentle yet firm. Richard paused, processing her words. He had always prided himself on his ability to teach others, to be the one people turned to for advice and guidance. But now, in this moment, it was clear that he had been the one to learn the most. He looked down at Amara, who stood beside her mother, her quiet confidence still radiating. She hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't sought out the spotlight, but somehow, she had become the most powerful presence in the room. Richard realized that true greatness wasn't about demanding attention. It was about living with integrity, with the kind of quiet strength that inspired respect without needing to prove anything. "I've spent my whole life building an empire, thinking that control was everything," Richard said, more to himself than anyone else. "But now, I see that it's not control that matters. It's about understanding the people around you, seeing them for who they really are." Amara, still standing quietly beside her mother, looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "It's about recognizing the value in others," she said softly, "even when they're not what you expect." Richard nodded slowly, his mind racing with the realization that he had spent so much time trying to outsmart the world that he had missed the most important lesson of all. "I see that now," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "And I'm grateful for it. I was wrong about you, both of you. I've learned more in the past few hours than I have in years." Maria nodded, a quiet smile on her face. "Sometimes, it takes a moment like this to really understand what's important," she said. Richard looked at her, a new respect in his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything." The three of them stood there for a moment, the weight of the evening settling in. Richard had come to this event thinking he would be the one teaching lessons, the one in control. But in the end, it was Maria and Amara who had taught him something far more valuable. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about recognizing the strength in others, no matter who they were. And in that moment, Richard Bennett knew he would never look at the world the same way again. As the night wore on, the atmosphere in the room began to settle into a more relaxed rhythm, though the reverberations of what had happened earlier still hung in the air. Richard Bennett, standing near the bar, could still feel the weight of his earlier realization pressing down on him. He had spent years thinking he understood everything about success, about power, control, and influence. Yet in just one evening, he had learned that those things weren't the keys to true greatness. He could still see Amara's composed face, her calmness in the face of his arrogance. It had been a humbling experience for him, something he hadn't expected. He was used to being in charge, used to making decisions that shaped the direction of his life and others. But this moment, this encounter with Amara, had shifted something deep inside him. He wasn't the only one who could teach lessons, and he wasn't the only one capable of making an impact. He had been blind, so focused on his own world, that he had failed to see the true power that lay in others. Maria, standing beside him now, was a constant reminder of how much he had overlooked. Her quiet strength, her steady composure, and the fierce love she had for her daughter were all things Richard had never fully acknowledged. He had seen Maria only as a server, a background figure in a world that valued wealth and status above all else. But tonight, she had shown him that the most powerful forces were not always the loudest, nor the most obvious. They were the ones who moved quietly, but with purpose. He turned to her, the words coming to him with a weight he had never felt before. "Maria," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, "I've underestimated you. I've underestimated Amara. And in doing so, I've missed so much." Maria looked at him, her expression soft but knowing. She had seen Richard's arrogance before, but she also knew that the man standing before her had just experienced a shift, one that would change how he viewed the world. "It's not about what you've missed, Richard," she said gently. "It's about what you see now, what you recognize." Richard nodded slowly. "I see it now," he said, his voice quiet but filled with sincerity. "I see that there's so much more to life than just control, so much more to people than what meets the eye." He turned his gaze back to Amara, who was standing with her arms crossed, a quiet strength emanating from her. She had not sought out this moment, nor had she demanded attention. Yet here she was, standing tall, proving that true power did not lie in the hands of those who screamed the loudest, but in those who moved through the world with grace, dignity, and intelligence. Richard's respect for her was immense. It was a respect he had never fully given anyone before, not in the way he was feeling it now. "Amara," he said, his voice catching slightly as he addressed her directly for the first time since the game. "You've taught me something tonight that no one else ever has. You've shown me what true greatness is." Amara, still the quiet force she had been from the start, met his gaze, but she didn't respond with words. She didn't need to. Her steady eyes spoke volumes. Richard understood that now. He understood that the quietest voices were often the strongest, the most impactful. They were the voices that carried the most weight, even in the smallest of actions. He turned to Maria once more. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything, for showing me that greatness isn't about what I thought it was. It's about understanding others, seeing them for who they really are, and recognizing the strength in all the quiet places." Maria smiled softly. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but of quiet satisfaction. "Sometimes it takes a little humility to truly see," she said. Richard looked at Amara again, a new sense of admiration in his heart. "You both have changed me," he said, "and for that, I am truly grateful." The night had begun as a high-profile gathering of power and influence, but it had ended with something far more meaningful, something that would stay with Richard Bennett long after the lights went down and the guests went home. He had learned that the greatest lessons in life weren't found in the boardrooms or the board meetings. They were found in the quiet moments, in the people who never asked to be seen, but whose impact was undeniable. As the evening slowly came to an end, Richard Bennett found himself standing alone in the grand ballroom, the weight of the night's events pressing heavily on his shoulders. The clinking of glasses and the soft hum of conversations around him seemed distant, almost muted, as his mind replayed everything that had happened. The chess game, the realization that had come afterward, and the quiet strength of Maria and Amara. It had all changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had spent his entire life building walls around himself, believing that control, wealth, and status were the things that defined success. But now, standing in the aftermath of everything that had transpired, he could see that those walls had only kept him from understanding what truly mattered. Maria and Amara had taught him more in a few hours than he had learned in a lifetime of high-stakes business deals and power plays. Richard had always been quick to dismiss others, quick to judge based on appearances, on the things he could measure. But now, He understood that true greatness couldn't be measured by the amount of money in your bank account or the titles you carried. It was about the quiet moments, the ones that happened when no one was watching, the ones where you chose to stand up, to do the right thing, even when no one expected it. He had learned that true strength wasn't about dominating others. It was about lifting them up, about recognizing their worth, even when society told you not to. Richard looked over at Amara, who was standing with her mother, quietly talking to a few of the guests who had lingered. There was no arrogance in her demeanor, no sense of pride in her victory. She wasn't seeking validation, nor was she looking for praise. She simply existed, confident in who she was, secure in the knowledge that she didn't need anyone else's approval to prove her worth. And for the first time in his life, Richard understood what that felt like. He had spent so many years chasing after the approval of others, seeking validation from people who would never truly see him for who he was. But now, standing here, he realized that the only approval he needed was his own. And it wasn't just about approval. It was about respect. True respect, the kind that came from understanding, from seeing people for who they truly were, not for what you assumed them to be. Richard walked toward Maria and Amara, his steps slow but purposeful. When he reached them, he stopped, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. He had never been one to admit fault, never been one to apologize easily, but tonight had taught him something important, that sometimes it was necessary to humble yourself, to admit when you were wrong, and to make things right. "I don't know how to thank you," Richard said, his voice quiet but sincere. "You've taught me more than I ever could have imagined. I've spent my life thinking I knew what was important, but I was wrong." Maria smiled, her expression calm and kind. "You don't need to thank us, Richard," she said softly. "You've already learned what matters. That's enough." Richard looked at Amara, her gaze steady and unwavering. "You were right all along," he said. "I've been so focused on building an empire that I forgot what it really means to be powerful. It's not about control, not about money. It's about recognizing the strength in others and respecting that." Amara nodded, her quiet confidence shining through. "Sometimes, the strongest people don't need to shout the loudest," she said, her voice soft but firm. "True strength comes from within, and it's something that can't be taken away." Richard nodded slowly, his heart swelling with a newfound respect for the young girl who had, without even trying, taught him more than any business meeting ever could. He stood there for a moment longer, taking it all in. The lessons, the humility, the quiet strength that had changed everything for him. And in that moment, Richard Bennett knew that he would never look at the world the same way again. He had learned the most important lesson of all. The true measure of a person wasn't found in their wealth, their power, or their success. It was found in their ability to recognize the worth in others, to see beyond the surface and acknowledge the strength that lay within.